The cruelest thing anyone can do to a grieving woman is make her feel unwanted in her own home. I heard those words in my head long before my daughter-in-law whispered something even worse beside my husband's coffin. The funeral home smelled like lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that stays in your clothes long after everyone leaves. I stood beside Harold's casket with my black gloves folded tightly in my hands, trying to smile at relatives I barely recognized through my tears. 42 years of marriage had ended on a rainy Thursday morning in a hospital room just outside Chicago, and somehow I was expected to stand there greeting people like a hostess at a dinner party. My feet hurt in my low heels. My chest felt hollow, and every few seconds, someone touched my shoulder and said the same thing. He was such a wonderful man. They were right. Harold Whitmore had been steady, gentle, dependable. The kind of husband who warmed my car in winter before church and never forgot to bring me coffee exactly the way I liked it. 2 creams. No sugar. I kept waiting for him to walk through those funeral home doors with that crooked smile of his and tell everyone there had been some terrible mistake. But instead, I watched people carry flowers past his coffin while my son Daniel stood near the front talking quietly with his wife Vanessa. She wore a fitted black dress that looked far too elegant for a funeral, her blonde hair pinned neatly behind one ear, her makeup untouched by grief. Every time someone hugged her, she pressed a tissue to the corner of her eye like she was performing sadness instead of feeling it. Then she noticed me looking at her. She smiled instantly. Sweet, polite, perfect. Do you need anything, Eleanor? She asked softly as she walked toward me. I shook my head. I'm all right. That was a lie. Nothing about me was all right. Harold had been gone for 3 days, and already the house felt colder, quieter. Wrong. Vanessa leaned closer, as if she were about to comfort me. For one foolish second, I thought maybe I had judged her too harshly over the years. Maybe grief was bringing us together. Then her lips brushed near my ear, and in a voice so calm it barely sounded human, she whispered, "You're alone now." I froze. At first I thought I'd misheard her. The room around me continued moving normally. Someone coughed near the back row. A child laughed somewhere outside the chapel doors. But my body went completely still. Vanessa pulled away slowly, her expression unchanged, almost pleasant. Then she gave my hand a gentle squeeze for anyone watching nearby and said louder, "Harold would want you to stay strong." I stared at her, unable to speak. She turned before I could respond and walked back toward Daniel, resting her hand lightly against his arm. My son didn't look at me. Not once. I wish I could say that was the moment everything changed, but the truth is something had been changing for a long time inside that family, and I had been too busy loving them to see it. Standing there beside my husband's coffin, surrounded by flowers we could barely afford and sympathy that suddenly felt fake, I realized something terrifying. I was no longer being treated like Daniel's mother. I was becoming a problem they needed to solve. The house sounded different after the funeral. That was the first thing I noticed when we came home that evening. For 42 years, Harold had filled every room without even trying. The creak of his recliner in the den, the low hum of old jazz records on Sunday mornings, the way he cleared his throat before speaking whenever he was about to say something important. But that night, the silence felt heavy enough to sit beside me at the kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the windows while I stood at the sink staring into the backyard. Harold had planted those rose bushes himself nearly 20 years ago, and now the petals drooped under the storm like they were grieving too. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting Daniel. Instead, Vanessa walked into the kitchen carrying her phone in one hand and a legal pad in the other. "You should probably get some rest," she said without looking up from the notes she was writing. Her voice sounded gentle, but distant, like a nurse speaking to a patient. "It has been a long day." I nodded slowly. "I might make some tea first." "Maybe. Caffeine is not the best idea tonight." She opened the refrigerator, moving things around like she already owned every shelf inside it. "You have been forgetful lately." The words hit me strangely. Forgetful. Harold had passed away 3 days earlier, and somehow she was already talking about me like I was fragile. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and reached for the kettle anyway. Vanessa sighed quietly. "Daniel and I were talking earlier," she said. "We think it might be good to simplify things around here for a while." I looked at her. Simplify? Before she could answer, Daniel entered the kitchen. My son looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes red from either grief or lack of sleep. Maybe both. For a second, I saw the little boy who used to run into my arms after Little League games with grass stains on his knees. But then he glanced at Vanessa before speaking, and something inside me tightened. "Mom," he said carefully. "Vanessa thinks maybe we should move some things around upstairs." "What things?" Neither of them answered immediately. Vanessa finally stepped forward and placed her hand lightly against Daniel's back, guiding the conversation like she always did. "The master bedroom has a lot of memories," she said softly. "We just thought it might be healthier if you stayed in the guest room for a little while." I stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to leave my bedroom?" Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "Just temporarily. Your father died in that room." My voice cracked before I could stop it. Vanessa gave me that same polished expression she had worn all day at the funeral home. Concern mixed with patience. The look people use when they are pretending not to be cruel. "Exactly," she said gently. "We are worried it might be emotionally overwhelming for you." I wanted to argue, but grief had drained the strength from my body. Everything felt blurry, heavy. I suddenly realized I had not eaten since morning. Daniel stepped closer and kissed the top of my head quickly. "We are only trying to help." Then his phone buzzed. He checked it instantly. Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered something too quietly for me to hear. The two of them walked out of the kitchen together while I stood alone beside the stove holding a cold teacup in trembling hands. A few minutes later, I went upstairs and stopped in the hallway. The door to my bedroom was halfway closed. Through the opening, I could hear drawers sliding open and shut. Vanessa was already inside reorganizing my life. The next morning, I woke up disoriented in the guest room, staring at unfamiliar floral wallpaper that Vanessa had chosen years ago for holiday visitors. For a few seconds, I forgot Harold was gone. Then reality settled over me again like wet cement on my chest. I sat up slowly, expecting to hear the sound of his razor buzzing in the bathroom or the smell of coffee drifting down the hallway. Instead, I heard laughter downstairs. Vanessa's laughter. Bright, carefree, completely untouched by mourning. I slipped on my robe and walked carefully toward the kitchen. The hallway looked different already. The framed photograph of Harold and me from our anniversary trip to Maine was gone from the wall near the staircase. In its place hung a black and white picture of Daniel and Vanessa smiling on a beach somewhere. I stopped for a moment staring at the empty nail hole where my photograph used to be. Then I heard Vanessa's voice again. "She slept almost 10 hours, she said quietly. "Honestly, I think she is more fragile than she realizes." I froze near the bottom stair. Daniel answered in a low voice I could barely hear. "Maybe, but let us not rush anything." Vanessa sighed dramatically. "Daniel, your mother cannot manage this house alone anymore. Look at her. She forgets things constantly." My hand tightened around the banister. Forgets things? 2 weeks earlier, I had balanced the checkbook, organized Harold's medications, and hosted 12 people for Sunday dinner without help from anyone. But now suddenly I was being spoken about like an aging relative nobody trusted. I stepped into the kitchen before they realized I had overheard them. Vanessa immediately changed her expression into concern. "Good morning, Eleanor," she said sweetly. "I was just about to make oatmeal." Daniel avoided eye contact while stirring coffee into a travel mug. "Morning, Mom." I sat carefully at the table. Harold's chair across from me was empty. Vanessa placed a bowl in front of me along with a spoon, then glanced toward Daniel. "Did you tell her about the appointment?" she asked casually. I looked up. "What appointment?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Vanessa thought maybe it would help if you talked to someone." "Someone?" "A grief counselor," Vanessa interrupted smoothly. "And maybe a doctor too, just to evaluate stress levels and memory concerns." I stared at her in disbelief. "My memory is fine." "Of course," she said quickly, smiling in that patient way that made me feel smaller every time she did it. "We just want to make sure you are taking care of yourself." Daniel grabbed his keys from the counter. "I have to head to the office for a few hours." I looked at him sharply. "You are going back to work already?" He shrugged weakly. "Life keeps moving." Then he kissed Vanessa on the cheek and left without even touching my shoulder on the way out. The front door closed, and silence settled over the kitchen again. Vanessa slowly sipped her coffee while scrolling through something on her phone. Finally, she looked at me and said, "You know, Eleanor, a lot of women your age actually prefer assisted living communities. They have activities, transportation, social events." My stomach tightened instantly. "I am not moving into a facility." "Nobody said immediately," she replied softly. "But this house is very large. Taxes alone are almost $11,000 a year now. I looked at her carefully then, really looked at her. And for the first time since Harold died, I noticed something beneath the sweetness in her eyes. Calculation. Not grief. Not concern. Calculation. As if every conversation happening in that house had already been planned before my husband was even buried. 3 days after the funeral, I started noticing little things disappearing. At first, I blamed grief. Everyone says grief makes your mind foggy. But deep down, something felt wrong. Harold's leather briefcase vanished from the den. The spare garage key that had hung beside the laundry room for 20 years was suddenly gone. Even the small ceramic bowl near the front door, where Harold used to leave loose change and receipts, had disappeared overnight. Every object connected to my husband seemed to be quietly erased from the house piece by piece. That Thursday afternoon, I decided to look for our banking folder. Harold had always kept important paperwork inside the bottom drawer of his office filing cabinet. Insurance policies, tax returns, retirement accounts. I walked into his office expecting comfort, but the room no longer felt like his. Vanessa had opened the curtains wide, removed Harold's old wool blanket from the reading chair, and replaced family photos with decorative candles that smelled like vanilla. The room looked staged now, like a model home waiting for strangers to buy it. I knelt carefully beside the filing cabinet and pulled open the bottom drawer. Empty. My stomach dropped instantly. I checked the second drawer. Nothing. The folders were gone. Every single one. I sat frozen on the carpet for several seconds trying to think clearly. Harold never moved those papers. Never. He used to joke that if the house ever caught fire, the filing cabinet would be the first thing he saved after me. I heard heels approaching down the hallway before Vanessa appeared in the doorway holding her phone. "Oh," she said casually. "You should not be bending down like that." I slowly stood up. "Where are Harold's files?" She tilted her head slightly. "Daniel moved some paperwork upstairs." "Why?" "To organize things." Her answers always came too quickly, too smoothly. I stared at her. Without asking me, Vanessa crossed her arms gently, almost defensively. "Eleanor, nobody is trying to upset you. We are only handling responsibilities that might be stressful for you right now. Those are my financial records." "Actually," she said softly, "most of them were in Daniel's name too." Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. "What does that mean?" Before she could answer, my phone rang in my pocket. It was First National Bank downtown. Relief washed over me immediately. Harold and I had banked there since 1989. At least one thing in my life still felt familiar. I answered quickly. "Hello." A professional woman introduced herself from the fraud department and politely explained there had been unusual activity involving one of our joint accounts. Confused, I asked what kind of activity. There was a short pause. "Ma'am, according to our records, authorized transfer paperwork was submitted 48 hours ago." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Transferred to whom?" The woman hesitated slightly. "I believe your son Daniel Whitmore and an additional authorized family member." I looked directly at Vanessa. She remained perfectly calm, watching me. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. "Harold handled those accounts." "I understand," the bank employee replied carefully. "But the documentation appears legally signed." My hand trembled so badly I nearly dropped the phone. After the call ended, silence filled the office. Vanessa stepped closer and lowered her voice. "You really should let Daniel take care of these things now." I stared at her in disbelief. "Did Harold approve this before he died?" She gave a tiny shrug. "Your husband knew changes needed to happen eventually." Something sharp moved through my chest then. Not grief this time. Suspicion. Because Harold had spent 42 years protecting me from uncertainty. He would never move money behind my back. Never. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. Vanessa was not waiting for me to fall apart after losing my husband. She was already acting like I had. The following Saturday, Vanessa insisted on hosting what she called a small family dinner. She said it would help everyone heal after the funeral. By 6 o'clock, the dining room was filled with relatives carrying casseroles, bottles of wine, and awkward sympathy smiles. Harold's younger sister Patricia sat near the fireplace, talking softly with cousins I had not seen in years. Normally, I loved hosting family dinners. Harold used to stand at the grill in the backyard while music drifted through the kitchen windows and everyone laughed too loudly over dessert. But this dinner felt staged somehow. Artificial. like everyone had unknowingly walked into a performance where only Vanessa knew the script. I noticed immediately that my usual seat at the head of the table had been taken. Vanessa had placed herself there beside Daniel, arranging candles and folded linen napkins with careful precision. My place setting sat near the far end beside the children. I stood there for a second staring at it until Patricia whispered, "Honey, are you all right?" I forced a smile. Of course. During dinner, Vanessa controlled every conversation with polished charm. She spoke about grief counseling, estate paperwork, and future plans in that same soft voice she always used when she wanted to sound compassionate. Every few minutes, she found subtle ways to humiliate me without sounding openly cruel. "Eleanor has been so forgetful lately," she told Patricia while spooning green beans onto her plate. "Yesterday, she almost left the stove on." That was a lie. I had forgotten a kitchen timer for less than 2 minutes. "We are just worried about her living independently," Vanessa added gently. Several relatives glanced at me with uncomfortable pity. Daniel stayed silent beside her, cutting his chicken into tiny pieces like a nervous child. My own son could not even defend me at my own dinner table. Later, while dessert was being served, Vanessa suddenly smiled toward me across the table. "Actually, Daniel and I have been researching some beautiful assisted living communities nearby." The room went quiet instantly. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Patricia frowned. "Assisted living?" Vanessa nodded sympathetically. "Only because we care about Eleanor's safety. The house is becoming difficult for her to manage alone." "I am sitting right here," I said quietly. Vanessa touched her chest dramatically. "Oh goodness, nobody is attacking you." Then she lowered her voice just enough to sound reasonable. "We simply think it may be healthier for everyone if there is more structure and support." Everyone avoided eye contact with me after that. I suddenly felt invisible inside my own home, like a guest waiting politely for permission to stay. After dinner ended, I escaped to the upstairs hallway while relatives gathered coats downstairs. My chest felt tight from trying not to cry in front of them. As I passed Daniel and Vanessa's bedroom, I heard voices through the partially open door. "The realtor said the market is still strong," Vanessa whispered. "If we list before fall, we could get over 900,000. Daniel answered quietly, "Not yet. Daniel, we cannot keep waiting forever. Your mother barely notices what is happening." I stopped breathing. Realtor? Selling the house. My house. Harold's house? The home we spent 3 decades paying for together? Vanessa continued speaking in a calm, almost irritated tone. "Once she transitions somewhere smaller, everything becomes easier." Transitions. She talked about removing me from my own life the way people discuss moving old furniture into storage. My knees suddenly felt weak. I stepped backward carefully before they could hear me outside the door. Downstairs, relatives laughed softly near the front entrance while winter wind rattled the windows. The whole house looked warm and normal from the outside. But standing alone in that hallway, I finally understood something terrifying. Vanessa was not just trying to control me. She was trying to erase me from the life Harold and I built together. The next morning, I could not stop thinking about what I overheard upstairs. Every word replayed in my mind while I folded laundry in the guest room that no longer felt temporary. Vanessa wanted the house sold. Daniel was letting her plan everything. And somehow my grief had become their opportunity. Around noon, Vanessa announced she was taking the children shopping while Daniel was at work. Her voice sounded cheerful again, almost relieved to leave the house. "Do not overdo it today, Eleanor," she called as she grabbed her purse. "You seem tired after dinner." I waited until I heard the garage door close before setting the towels aside. My heart was beating harder than it should have been for a 68-year-old woman walking down a hallway, but instinct told me to move quickly. Harold had always kept backup items in the garage. Old tax boxes, toolkits, winter supplies, things Daniel and Vanessa had never bothered touching because they considered the garage cluttered. I slipped on Harold's old navy cardigan and stepped into the cold garage air. Dust floated through thin sunlight coming from the side window. For a moment, just standing there hurt. Harold loved this garage. Saturday mornings, he would spend hours fixing little things nobody else noticed. Tightening cabinet hinges, organizing screws in labeled jars, listening to baseball games on a small radio near the workbench. I slowly walked toward the metal storage shelves in the back corner. Most of the boxes looked untouched, but then I noticed something strange. Harold's old brown suitcase sat beneath a tarp near the floor. My stomach tightened immediately. We had not used that suitcase since a road trip to Vermont almost 15 years earlier. I crouched carefully and pulled it free. The zipper stuck halfway before finally opening with a rough metallic sound. Inside were old sweaters, travel brochures, and beneath them, a large sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Harold's handwriting. Eleanor. My hand started shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a folded letter and a small flash drive taped to the paper. I sat down slowly on a wooden stool near the workbench and unfolded the letter. Eleanor, if you are reading this, something has already gone very wrong. I stopped breathing for a second. Harold's handwriting looked rushed compared to normal. Uneven. Nervous. The letter continued. I did not want to worry you while I was alive, but there are conversations happening in this house that concern me deeply. Vanessa has been pressuring Daniel about money for over a year now. More than once, I overheard discussions about transferring assets and future arrangements involving you. I tried speaking to Daniel privately, but he avoids conflict whenever Vanessa is involved. My chest tightened painfully as I kept reading. I have protected copies of all financial documents in our safe deposit box downtown. Do not trust any paperwork unless you personally verify it with our attorney, Richard Levinson. Most importantly, do not allow anyone to convince you that you are incapable of managing your own life. Tears blurred my vision. Harold knew. Somehow, before he died, Harold had already seen what was happening around me. At the bottom of the page was one final sentence written darker than the rest. If they begin treating you like a burden, it is because they are trying to make you surrender. I covered my mouth with trembling fingers. For the first time since the funeral, my grief mixed with something else entirely. Clarity. Suddenly, the missing files, the bank transfers, the conversations about assisted living all connected together like pieces of a puzzle I had been too heartbroken to solve. I looked down at the flash drive resting in my palm. Whatever Harold left on it was important enough for him to hide from his own family. And deep in my chest, beneath the sadness and exhaustion, I felt something beginning to return. Not fear. Not weakness. Resolve. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep before plugging Harold's flash drive into my old laptop. The house was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock near the staircase and the low hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I sat at the small desk in the guest room with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, suddenly feeling like a stranger hiding inside my own home. The flash drive contained only 3 files. One was labeled financial copies. Another was labeled attorney notes. The third simply said listen first. My pulse quickened as I clicked it open. Harold's voice filled the room immediately. Weak, tired, but unmistakably his. Eleanor, if you are hearing this, then I was right to worry. Tears filled my eyes at the sound of him speaking again. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from crying out loud. I know you probably think I am being paranoid, he continued softly, but I need you to trust me now. Vanessa has been pushing Daniel to pressure me into restructuring accounts for months. She thinks I do not notice things, but I do. I sat frozen in the dim light while Harold explained everything. Vanessa had repeatedly suggested selling the house while he was still alive. She wanted Daniel to gain immediate access to retirement funds. Twice, Harold caught her searching through paperwork in his office when she thought nobody was home. I kept hoping Daniel would stand up to her, Harold said quietly in the recording. But every time she pushes, he gives in easier. My chest ached listening to the sadness in his voice. Near the end of the recording, Harold cleared his throat slowly before speaking again. If things become difficult after I am gone, contact Richard Levinson immediately. He has copies of every original document. And Eleanor, do not let anyone convince you that grief makes you incapable. You are stronger than they think. The recording ended, leaving the room painfully quiet. I wiped my eyes and opened the attorney folder next. Inside were scanned copies of legal paperwork, property records, and notes from meetings Harold had with our attorney during the last 6 months. One sentence near the bottom of a document caught my attention instantly. Temporary authorization granted under family request during medical emergency. Temporary, not permanent. My breathing steadied for the first time in days. Vanessa and Daniel had access to some accounts, but Harold had never intended for them to control everything. They had manipulated the situation after his hospitalization. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the guest room. I slammed the laptop closed instantly. The footsteps paused near my door. Eleanor. Vanessa's voice floated softly through the darkness. Are you awake? No. I answered automatically before realizing how ridiculous that sounded. A short silence followed. Then the doorknob shifted slightly. Locked. Thank God I had locked it. You should really try sleeping, Vanessa said sweetly through the door. You looked exhausted today. I stared at the door without answering. After several seconds, her footsteps finally moved away. But I remained frozen in bed long after the hallway became silent again. The next morning, I drove downtown alone for the first time since Harold died. Vanessa seemed surprised when I picked up my purse near the front door. Where are you going? She asked carefully. Out. Do you want me to come with you? No. The word came out firmer than I expected. She blinked slightly at my tone. At Richard Levinson's law office, the receptionist greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. 10 minutes later, Richard entered carrying a thick folder. He sat down across from me slowly and sighed. Eleanor, he said quietly, I have been waiting for you to come. In that moment, I realized something important. Harold had not left me helpless. He had left me protected. And for the first time since standing beside my husband's coffin, I no longer felt like prey. When I returned home from Richard Levinson's office that afternoon, I noticed something immediately. Vanessa was nervous. She stood in the kitchen pretending to organize groceries, but her eyes followed me the second I walked through the front door. You were gone a long time, she said lightly. I removed my coat slowly and hung it beside Harold's old jacket, which she still had not moved. Downtown traffic. She smiled, but I could see tension in the corners of her mouth. You should have called. We were worried. We. That word almost made me laugh. Nobody in that house had worried about me in weeks. Daniel came downstairs a few moments later holding his laptop. Everything okay, Mom? For the first time since Harold died, I looked directly at my son without fear or confusion clouding my thoughts. Richard had spent 2 hours explaining everything carefully. Harold's original will was protected. The house legally belonged to me. The temporary financial access Vanessa manipulated during Harold's hospitalization could be challenged immediately. And most importantly, Richard confirmed something that changed everything. Harold had quietly documented concerns about financial pressure from Daniel and Vanessa months before his death. Everything is fine, I answered calmly. Vanessa studied my face for a second too long. She sensed something had changed even if she could not yet identify what. That evening, she announced another family dinner for the upcoming Sunday. I think it would be good for everyone to reconnect, she said while pouring wine into Daniel's glass. Especially after all the stress lately. I nearly admired how effortlessly she performed kindness. That sounds lovely, I replied softly. Her eyes flickered with surprise at my agreement. Over the next 2 days, I stayed quiet. I watched. I listened. And for the first time, I stopped reacting emotionally to every cruel little comment. Instead, I noticed patterns. Vanessa constantly spoke about me as if I were not present. Eleanor gets confused with passwords. Eleanor should not drive long distances alone. Eleanor has trouble managing stress. Each sentence was carefully designed to create an image of helplessness. Daniel repeated her language now too, almost unconsciously. By Friday night, I realized something painful. My son was no longer thinking for himself. He had slowly absorbed Vanessa's version of reality until even he believed I was becoming incapable. But Harold had left me more than legal protection. He had left evidence. Saturday morning, Richard emailed me scanned copies of financial records along with transcripts from conversations Harold documented after meetings with their financial advisor. One line stood out sharply. Vanessa Whitmore requested accelerated property transfer options contingent upon Eleanor Whitmore relocating from residence. Contingent upon relocating me. They had already planned my removal before Harold was even gone. That night, while Vanessa decorated the dining room for Sunday dinner, she suddenly smiled toward me from across the kitchen island. I was actually thinking tomorrow might be the perfect time to discuss future arrangements with the family. I folded a dish towel carefully. Future arrangements? Just practical matters, she said sweetly. Long-term care. Housing. Financial simplification. Financial simplification. Such polite words for theft. Daniel walked in carrying boxes from the garage and nodded toward Vanessa. We all just want what is best for you, Mom. I looked at him quietly for several seconds. He could not even hear himself anymore. Of course, I answered gently. Tomorrow sounds perfect. Later that night, after everyone went upstairs, I sat alone at the dining room table. The same table where Harold taught Daniel multiplication homework. The same table where we celebrated birthdays and graduations and Christmas dinners for nearly 30 years. Vanessa had placed fresh flowers in the center now, trying to make the room look elegant for her performance tomorrow. I reached into my purse and carefully laid several items beside my plate. Richard's documents, the original property records, bank statements, and finally, Harold's flash drive. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the dark suburban street while the grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway. For weeks, they had mistaken my grief for weakness. Tomorrow, they were finally going to understand the difference. Sunday dinner began exactly the way Vanessa wanted. Candles glowed across the dining room table. Soft piano music drifted from the speaker in the kitchen. Relatives filled the house again, carrying desserts and bottles of wine, while Vanessa floated through the room, greeting everyone like the perfect hostess. Patricia sat beside me this time, quietly squeezing my hand under the table as if she sensed something unusual in the air. Daniel looked exhausted again, distracted, barely speaking during dinner. Vanessa, however, seemed energized, confident. Halfway through the meal, she gently tapped her wine glass with a spoon. "I actually wanted to discuss something important tonight," she announced warmly. Conversations stopped immediately. As everyone knows, the past few weeks have been difficult for Eleanor. She turned toward me with that practiced expression of concern. "Daniel and I have been trying very hard to support her while also considering what is healthiest long-term." My relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Patricia frowned slightly beside me. Vanessa continued speaking in the calm voice she used whenever she wanted to sound compassionate instead of controlling. "We have found a beautiful assisted living community about 20 minutes away. They have wonderful staff, activities, transportation, everything." Daniel stared down at his plate while she spoke. "We believe it may be time to start helping Eleanor transition into a more manageable lifestyle." Transition. There was that word again. The room fell painfully silent. Vanessa smiled softly toward the family like she expected admiration for her generosity. Then she looked directly at me. "Of course, we only want what is best for you." I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. For the first time since Harold died, my hands were completely steady. "That is interesting," I said quietly. Vanessa blinked slightly. "What is?" "Because Harold and I already made plans for what was best for me." Confusion flickered across Daniel's face. I reached calmly into my purse and removed the thick envelope Richard prepared for me. Then I laid the documents carefully in the center of the table beside the candles. "The original property records," I said softly. "The original will. And copies of every financial authorization signed during Harold's hospitalization." Vanessa's smile disappeared instantly. Daniel looked up sharply. "Mom, what is this?" "The truth." Nobody moved while I slid Harold's flash drive across the table. Harold documented everything before he died, including concerns about pressure involving the house and our finances. Vanessa's face turned pale. "Eleanor, I think you are misunderstanding." "No," I interrupted calmly. "I finally understand perfectly." I looked directly at Daniel. "Your father never transferred ownership of this home. Legally, it belongs entirely to me." Daniel stared at the paperwork in disbelief, while Vanessa's composure began cracking around the edges. "That cannot be right," she whispered. "Richard Levinson confirmed it Friday morning," I replied. "He also confirmed that temporary account access does not grant ownership." Patricia slowly reached for the documents while several relatives exchanged stunned looks around the table. The room no longer felt warm and elegant. It felt exposed. Vanessa suddenly straightened in her chair. "We were only trying to help you." I looked at her quietly for several seconds before answering. "No, you were trying to make me feel weak enough to surrender my life." Complete silence followed. Even the children in the other room had stopped making noise. Daniel finally looked toward Vanessa, confusion and embarrassment washing across his face all at once. "You told me Dad wanted this," he said quietly. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came out. I stood slowly from the table and picked up Harold's old cardigan, draped over my chair. "Grief does not make a woman incapable," I said softly. "It teaches her exactly who is waiting for her to break." Then I walked out of the dining room while nobody said another word. For the first time in weeks, the house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like mine again.